Yes, there you are, Rabbi. So I'm just going to welcome everybody into our March meeting. Good to have you back with us. And we've got some very good special guests with us again this evening. And I hope you all celebrated Purim over the weekend. And we want to welcome our Rabbi Rosenberg to welcome everybody. And as usual, I'm sure he's got a story for us. Over to you, Rabbi.
Thank you, John. It's actually been a while, so because of travel and other commitments, because very special to join you here this evening. Yesterday had a very special day, Purim, but for me personally, I was in Sydney and there joined my grandchildren, so I'm pleased to know I've got a full array of Marvel Avengers as grandchildren, and that was very special for me. Certainly Purim's it's a fun day, an enjoyable day, but it's also a very meaningful day as well. So I just want to take one perspective of that day, and as we're coming towards the festival of Pesach, of Passover, I just want to contrast there the miracles that occurred on Purim as opposed to Pesach on Passover. On Pesach we know we saw God's open hand. Hashem would have done Cecil B. DeMille proud. 10 great plagues, splitting of the sea, the defeat of the world's great monarch, Ramses and his army. The hand of God was very, very clear. Purim, in a sense, is a polar opposite. We did not see the hand of Hashem. In fact, the name of Hashem is not even mentioned in the story of the Megillah. The miracle, the salvation of the Jewish people from the evil decree of Haman, was brought about by the hands of human beings, of Mordechai and Esther, perhaps a harbinger of the future. The question that I'm often asked, why are there no more miracles? Why are there no more miracles like the Exodus from Egypt? So I'll just give you two perspectives. One is when you have a small child, that child needs a lot of love, a lot of attention, a lot of guidance. In the sense at that time, the Jewish people were like a child. The birth of a nation was Passover, therefore they needed to be nurtured in faith, and therefore Hashem gave them that extra attention. As a nation matures, it needs to be weaned off that faith and those miracles. But perhaps a more practical reason why we don't have miracles anymore, because, to be blunt, miracles do not change human beings. One need only look at one of the greatest miracles that occurred at that time, the revelation at Mount Sinai 40 days later. After hearing the very word of God, the Jewish people sinned with the most heinous of sins, the golden calf. Miracles make a good impact, but they don't change and mold human beings. That's up to us. That's up to us. As John said, I will share with you a story of one of the great leaders of this generation, Rabbi Schneerson, the Rebbe. And he had a group of university students once in an audience, and the students, being students, asked him a wide variety of questions on philosophy, theology, Judaism, and he answered them all satisfactorily. He answered them well. And at the end, one of the students had a lot of chutzpah. Now, John, you have to help me. How do I translate chutzpah?
Passion? Passion is a good word.
Gold, cheek,
yeah.
Passion. And he asked, Rebbe, they say that you can perform miracles. Is that true? And the Rebbe responded, he says, absolutely, and I'm going to perform a miracle here and right now. The students are aghast. And he begins, he said, he looked at each one of them and said, I want each one of you to take one thing that you thought would be impossible to change within yourselves. Now make a commitment to do it over this next, over a period of time. And I will give you a blessing that you can and will. Today's miracles are brought about by human beings, and that's why this evening we're actually graced with two great miracle workers. Firstly, Joel Burnie, who changes the hearts and minds of the Jewish people on Israel, and Steve Lieblich will introduce him, and together with Rabbi Kennard, a colleague who has moulded the hearts and minds of youth as a principal and educator over 4 decades. Rabbi Kennard, to the community's dismay, has just recently retired as being principals of Melbourne's largest, Australia, I think even the Southern Hemisphere's largest Jewish day school, after serving there for 17 years. And prior to that, he was a principal of 2 schools in the United Kingdom. He studied maths at Oxford, and certainly a very sought-after speaker and writer across the Jewish spectrum. And God, he is blessed with 5 grandchildren. Rabbi Kennard, may there be many more. And he's looking forward to making Aliyah to the Holy Land after Pesach. And we wish him our best in that wonderful endeavor. Rabbi Kennard, if I could hand the microphone over to you.
Thank you, Rabbi Reisenberg, and thank you for those kind words. Just by the way, just to correct one point, I have 5 children. I have lots more grandchildren than that, Kanai Nahara. We're at that stage where we're beyond counting. Each one is more than a number, but it's a lot, Kanai Nahara, as we say. Can I also say it's an honor to be able to address this group. As I'm going to talk about, we in the Jewish community feel quite bereft of friends, let alone supporters. And when people are prepared to affix their colors to the mask of supporting Israel and do so in such a clear fashion, it's very reassuring, and it's very gratifying, and it's even empowering to members of the Jewish community. So thank you very much for all your efforts and your being able to put your heads above the parapet, and it really is a parapet, to show your support for Israel. So Rabbi Reisenberg asked me to speak really about an article that I wrote and was published in the Australian in the early stages of the war. It was actually published just 3 weeks after October the 7th. And I will review what I said there, but then perhaps bring it up to date, because sadly it needs updating. And the focus of, or the framing of my article was to start by saying, now I understand how the Holocaust happened. And I know that's a very dramatic thing to say, but what I mean is this. The Holocaust was a total and utter aberration in human history, or at least it seemed to be. Humanity has, thank God, roughly been on a progress towards greater democracy, greater human rights, greater sensitivity to the needs of others, from the barbaric times of prehistory through the Roman Empire, through the medieval period. And when we get to the 19th and 20th century, we feel that we've come a long way. And the Holocaust refuted that, because the utter depravity and the utter indescribable evil that took place in the Holocaust, both by the perpetrators and, well, we'll talk about this, those who could have acted and didn't. How could that actually happen? How could the world take such a vast backward leap in its progress? And after the events of October the 7th, and particularly in the immediate aftermath, I began to understand how it could have happened. And the reaction to people regarding October the 7th, I think, showed me how the world can take such a retrograde step. Edmund Burke is famously quoted, probably inaccurately, as saying, all that's necessary for evil to flourish is for good people to do nothing. And I would add that there are at least 3 other groups of people, three other circles, which are concentric circles, which enable evil to flourish. And the first is the perpetrators of evil. And we saw that on October the 7th. And because of what's so much has happened since then, which I'm going to come to, it's worth remembering what we must never, ever forget, that October the 7th was not just the worst act of terrorism against the Jewish people since the Holocaust. It was not just one of the worst aspects of terrorism worldwide, but the nature of the depravity was so outstanding in the negative sense, was so astonishing. The way that victims were lined up for slaughter, the way that they were mutilated before and after death, the rapes, the deliberate attacking of killing of children in front of their parents, of parents in front of their children, of burning corpses or burning people alive, and of course, taking 240 kidnap victims, including children, including elderly. It was a day of unparalleled atrocity, unparalleled depravity. So first, the first circle, if you like, the first circle of people who bring about this tremendous change in human behavior and change in our whole ethical, moral compass are those who perpetrate such a deed. And there were about 3,000 people perpetrating that deed on that day. But the second circle that is necessary for evil to flourish is those who support that deed. Now, in the days immediately after October the 7th, it was unthinkable that civilized people would come out and say this was a good thing. And yet that is what happened. We know there were demonstrations in Sydney on October the 8th where people shouted, well, was it gas the Jews or was it the rather obscure where's the Jews? It certainly wasn't nice about the Jews. We know that a professor in Cornell University said he was exhilarated by the news of what happened on that day. We know that there were celebrations in Gaza, obviously, in the West Bank, and indeed throughout the Arab world and throughout the Muslim world. And we know that there were dozens of individuals, and in fact, large numbers of people who said they supported what Hamas had done. Now, since then, we've been privileged to see the spectacle of people marching week after week after week in support of Hamas. Now, they might claim that they're in support of Palestinian rights, but if they were doing so, if that were the case, they'd be asking for Hamas to end their dictatorship and their brutal autocracy in the Palestinian area. They would be asking for a two-state solution, and they'd be asking for a number of other things, which they are not. The demonstrations are very clearly echoing the lines of Hamas from the river to the sea, which means the extinction of the state of Israel and all who live in it. We are seeing weekly people coming out in support of Hamas. And when you ask them, were the events of October the 7th justified? They say, well, yes, they were justified because, well, we'll come on to the justification next. So the third group, after the perpetrators and the supporters, is the justifiers, the ones who say, well, we don't necessarily support it. People shouldn't be taking action against civilians. Rape is not a good thing. But after all, Israel really did deserve it, didn't it? It deserved it because of the occupation, ignoring the fact that Gaza is not occupied, that in 2005, Israel withdrew every last soldier and civilian from Gaza. And it was a terrible heartache for the people of Israel, but it was a decision taken by the government and carried out. Jews were literally dragged from their houses in order to make the whole of Gaza, Judenrein, empty of Jews. 2 years later, Israel established legally a blockade when Hamas took over the Gaza Strip and declared it to be a launching pad for attacks on Israel and effectively declared war on Israel and went to war on Israel with firing rockets incessantly. And at that point, Israel imposed a blockade to prevent materials entering Gaza, which could be used for military purposes. That blockade was also imposed by Egypt. And on the basis of that, people say that the Gaza Strip is occupied, but that's completely to invert the meaning of the word. The Gaza Strip is not occupied. And to say it's occupied, that cannot be used as a justification for what happened on October the 7th. People say that Gaza before October the 7th was an open-air prison. It was a concentration camp. Well, it was a concentration camp with luxury malls and luxury apartments and ice cream shops. And I'll come back to, it's a significant reason why I mention ice cream shops, and the ability of people to come and go via Egypt to visit anywhere in the world. So I've just mentioned these things because they were raised as justifications for what happened on October the 7th. First of all, there is never a justification for the murder of children and elderly people and for the rape of women. There is never a justification for that, of course. But secondly, the supposed justifications that were put forward are nonsense and completely vacuous. But that third circle is part of the process by which evil can flourish. The ones who say, well, I don't necessarily support it, but I sort of do because I can explain to you why it was justified. And then we come to the fourth and largest circle. Then we come to Edmund Burke's people who do nothing. And in the early days, after October the 7th, when the moral compass was so clearly pointing the distinction between right and wrong, between civilization and barbarism, yet there were many people, in fact, I would say the vast majority of people that I came into contact with, who didn't want to take a stand because it was all a bit too complicated. Now, we'll talk in a moment about how that's changed over the last 5 months. But right at the beginning, when, yes, there had been on October the 8th and October the 9th, there were Israeli airstrikes, but the Jewish people were reeling, were bleeding and grieving, and still are, about the terrible atrocity of October the 7th, about those terrible lives lost in such horrific conditions, and about what was then 240 is now still nearly 140 people who've been kidnapped, wrestled away from their families, no idea if they're alive or dead, no idea if they're healthy and how they're managing to live in the tunnels underneath Gaza. And yet, so many people did not reach out their hand and say, how are you feeling? Or we are concerned about what happened in Israel. I was a school principal at the time, as you've heard. So ISV, the Independent Schools of Victoria, issued a statement saying, we're concerned how the situation in the Middle East might affect some of the school students. And that was the nearest thing they could bring themselves to say to show concern for the victims of October the 7th. So we were surrounded by people who refused to take a stand. I had a standoff with the representatives of the Independent Education Union, the IEU of Victoria, which many of their senior staff had signed a statement saying that what happened on October the 7th was a direct result of Israel's actions. And again, this was in the first few days after the atrocity. People were already blaming Israel for what had happened. And I remonstrated with the head of the union and I said, why aren't you disciplining your staff members? And the answer was, they stand by their statement. They don't think it's anti-Semitic, and therefore it isn't anti-Semitic, and therefore there doesn't need to be any disciplinary action. And I was appalled. But I think this was symptomatic of the action of many, many people who said, it's too complicated, we don't want to get involved. And that is why in those early days, the Jewish people felt incredibly bereft, incredibly lonely, and unfortunately, it was only a shadow of things to come. And I'll say again, that is why when I'm talking to people who are part of an organization which has "For Israel" in its title, it's very, very gratifying, and it's a very special experience actually to talk to people, non-Jewish people, who are prepared to say, we support Israel. So that was my thesis in my article, that you need not just good men to do nothing, you need perpetrators, you need supporters, you need justifiers, and then you need the people who'd rather stay neutral. And in that way, society can be perverted and can be turned into something where evil is allowed to flourish, even the greatest of evils. And when we read about how the Third Reich took power in Germany in the 30s, and little by little over the course of that decade, turned the whole society around and created an entire country of people who hated the Jews and were prepared to be part of the killing machine, one can see how it happens through an organized process. It doesn't happen immediately. It doesn't happen just like that miraculously. It happens because group after group are unable to speak out against evil. Now, I said that I have to bring my thesis up to date, because I think since that time, there were three types of reaction that very foolishly and very naively I did not predict. And the first is what can be called October 7th denial. If one spends too much time as I do in the sewers of Twitter, one sees over and over again, if anyone died on October the 7th, and we know there were no beheaded babies, and so the whole thing's a lie. And maybe something happened, but we don't know. And it's very easy in this age of conspiracy theories, fueled by the internet, which doesn't encourage you to think, it just encourages you to parrot. It's very easy to shed doubt on whatever anyone wants to say on any issue, be it climate change or European integration or who knows what, but particularly when it comes to Israel and the Jews, it's very easy to say you can't trust the Jews. The Jews are to be somehow considered in a different category of reliability. And when they say 1,200 people were killed, 240 were kidnapped, it's a common reaction to say, well, maybe it didn't happen. Or just to use one word or two to imply that, to say, if civilians were killed, then that was wrong. But the if does a lot of heavy lifting in a statement like that. Of course, ironically and almost comically, the people who say it didn't happen are the same people who say Israel deserved it. So they're living in that crazy world of saying nothing happened, but it should have done. And of course, the fact that the Hamas perpetrators filmed themselves committing these atrocities and proudly put it on social media doesn't stop the deniers. And just as we live with the awful trait of Holocaust denial, I think in a very, very similar fashion, we are living with October the 7th denial. Which leads me to the next point, which is this. I spoke to my school students on October the 9th, the first school day after the weekend, and I made the prediction that people will say that this is tit for tat killing. Hamas does X and Israel responds Y, and then Hamas does something and Israel does something. It's all tit for tat. It's all much of a muchness. And I told my students not to be taken in by that. There is no moral equivalence between Israel and Hamas. What I did not foresee, and I feel very foolish, is how quickly not only would there be moral equivalence between Israel and Hamas, but in fact there'd be a great inequivalence in the sense that Israel would be the monster. Israel would be demonized in the terrible way that it has been. It's not enough for Israel to kill people. It has to be genocide. It's not enough for Israel to discriminate. It has to be apartheid. And when there's about 50 conflicts going on in the world today, when 500,000 were killed in Syria, when 5 million have been killed in the Congo, when at least 200,000 have been killed in Sudan, when the Houthis, who are now the heroes of the left, have killed 100,000 in Yemen and reimposed slavery, and I can go on and on and on. Yet one little country, and I would say even if what it's accused of is true, which it isn't, but even if it is, everything that's been said about Israel, somehow that makes it the worst country in history, the worst country in the world. And I do not exaggerate. This is what people are saying. And even if they're not saying that, the demonization of Israel, which we see right throughout the media, including what people call the mainstream media, including the ABC and the SBS and the BBC, this way that Israel's actions are inevitably characterized as something evil, the way that Israeli spokesmen are inevitably characterized as unbelievable, unreliable, is this frightening demonization of Israel. And now, nearly 6 months after October the 7th, I reckon most people on the street, and not just those marchers, but most people on the street would say, yes, what happened on October 7th was bad, but what Israel has done is far, far worse, because Israel's been engaged in genocide. I just want to take the point to say, it's not genocide, it's war. War is hell. Terrible things happen in war. And when Hamas starts a war, the result is going to be terrible. But that is not genocide. And the third thing that I didn't predict, and again, foolishly, naively, was the tsunami of anti-Semitism that has taken over the world, basically. Not just on social media. People want to relegate social media as if it doesn't matter. It is the way people communicate with each other today in a very large way. And so what's on social media matters, but also what's being said by students across the world, by those marchers, by so-called elite universities, by the people who we expect to be the most educated, turn out to be the most ignorant and the least thinking. And the idea that Jews are somehow alien, somehow different, somehow, as I said before, not to be trusted, is a very frightening and very, very uncomfortable development of the last few months. Personally, I'm not one of those who say we're heading for another Holocaust. I think the Holocaust was a unique event in Jewish history, and I don't think we're leading up to that. But what I think we are seeing is a renewal of what I would call the 19th century type of anti-Semitism. In Western Europe and America and in the Western world, Jews were different, Jews were alien, Jews were not trusted. And in Eastern Europe, Jews were subject to physical violence and pogroms. That's what I think we're getting close to, and in many respects, we've actually returned to already. So these are very tough times for Jewish people. And all these different reactions that I've referred to, I think 4 in the original article, and I've added another 3, so that makes 7, is what it reminds Jews of very, very hard times in the past. I just want to conclude on the subject of anti-Semitism by saying this. There's a great debate whether this is a passing phase or is this the new normal. My personal view is it's the old normal. And I think the answer to that question will be determined by what arc of history one looks at. So I'm not a professional historian, but I love history, and I love history of the Jewish people, and I love the history of ideas. And if you look at the broad sweep of history, for 2,000 years, Jews were subject to what we would today call anti-Semitism. Jews were treated as different. Jews were forced to live on the margins of society. Jews with the Jewish fate was controlled by whoever happened to be the ruler. 2,000 years of quite difficult times to be a Jew. I was born in 1964. Yes, it's my birthday soon. And I feel I was part of a blessed generation that did not experience anti-Semitism. And I think we felt at that time that anti-Semitism had reached its nadir in the Holocaust, and the world had realized how evil it was, and the world had moved on, and anti-Semitism had been slain. Now we realize it was just sleeping. It was waiting for the moment to return. And I think what we've seen, obviously in the past couple of decades, but particularly post-October the 7th, is a return to that state of affairs where Jews are considered alien. And therefore, I regard this as a reversion to the old normal. And I fear very much that for my children and grandchildren, it will be a world in which they grow up where anti-Semitism is normative. For most of my children and all of my grandchildren, and in the next few weeks, my wife and me, we will be living in Israel, and therefore we'll have a very different perspective. But for Jews outside of Israel, I think the next few decades and maybe and beyond are going to be where we see again that anti-Semitism is woven into the fabric of civilization, whether we like it or not. So I conclude with thanking you for your patience, thank you for your audience, and thank you especially for your support of Israel and the Jewish people at this very, very difficult time. We absolutely need all the friends we can get, and we really, really appreciate all those friends. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rabbi. That's wonderful. It's great that you could share some time with us and explain those things. And I personally agree with you, as I'm sure many of us do. And we've got a bit of time before our next guest comes on, so we could open up for a couple of questions if you're okay with that.
Yes, I'm fine with that.
Yeah, Steve Lieblich's got his hand up to ask a question, and I'll pass to him in a minute. But before I do that, I'm just personally interested to know why you've decided now to do Aliyah.
Okay, that's a very interesting question, which I'm happy to answer. There are 3 reasons, and the order is important. So the least important is because of what I spent some of the speech talking about of anti-Semitism, that I feel Jewish life in the diaspora is going to get harder and harder and less comfortable. And that is a motivating factor, but it is not the motivating factor. And the Zionist dream is a positive one, not a negative one. It's about moving to somewhere, not running away from somewhere else. So the second reason is a personal one. It's about my children and my grandchildren. So I'm blessed with 5 children. 2 live here in Melbourne and are going to stay here, but 3 live in Israel. And our connection with them has been through video calls. Thank God that we live in a time where we have that technology, but it's not the same as being there. My oldest granddaughter is now 10, and we have been away from their lives for too long. And we very much look forward to being part of the lives of my children and grandchildren. But the main reason is the classic Zionist one, that we want to be part of where the destiny of the Jewish people is being forged. We want to live in the land that God promised to Abraham and his descendants. We want to be part of the Jewish miracle of the 20th century, which is the return to Israel and the recreation of the Jewish state, something that we're privileged to see and has been unique to our people. And we want to be part of the Jewish future. Now, I've been able, I think, to contribute a little bit in my own way to the Jewish future here in Melbourne, but I want to do more than that. I want to be part of where Jewish life is played out in the fullest possible extent. And that is where there is a Jewish state. That is where the richness of Jewish life is unparalleled. And that is where we want to be.
Yeah, wonderful, wonderful. And I just applaud you and say well done. And we would look forward to catching up with you perhaps next year or in 12 months' time to see how you've settled and how it is in Israel. So
Well, I'd be happy to do that.
Yeah,
and there may be stories of dealing with Israeli bureaucracy.
yes.
Often said that Israel likes the concept of immigration, it just doesn't like immigrants.
Yeah.
So we know there's going to be a lot to wrestle with, but we're up for it. So
Okay.
I'd be happy to share my reflections.
Yeah, that'd be great. Steve Lieblich, you've got your hand up for a question.
Yes, thanks very much, John. I first must say that we're most privileged to have heard from Rabbi Kennard, I had the pleasure of attending a lesson at a recent seminar in Perth where Rabbi Kennard explained Judaism in 10 words. And I can't help but say that I'm incredibly admiring of his eloquence and his clearly brilliant, incisive mind. And it's a privilege to have him address us here today. The article which he spoke about, I recall it very, very well, reading it in the Australian, and I must say it was an inspiration to me, particularly that fourth concentric circle. I'm perhaps optimistic and idealistic, and I believe that most Australians can recognise the difference between good and evil. However, they are in most of them are in that fourth circle of biting their tongues and not speaking up, and that inspired me to redouble my efforts to give people to enable Australians to speak up and to give them a voice, and for that reason, I think the work of SCAFI, the Southern Cross Alliance for Israel, is extremely important because we have many friends in the Christian community who read the Torah, who respect the Torah, and who respect the Jewish people, and so we need to all work together to give them the courage to speak up, and that's the way things will change. My question, Rabbi, is I guess you were a little you recognize that anti-Semitism is not going to be defeated, and we may be facing we are facing a resurgence. And I've heard people say recently, every Pesach we say that in every generation they stand up to annihilate us, and apparently that seems to be true. So while we can't defeat anti-Semitism, I'm told really what we should be working for is to make it socially unacceptable. So my question, Rabbi, what do you advise us, SCAFI and Friends of Israel? What can we do to at least make it socially unacceptable so that the anti-Semites go back into their lairs and bite their tongues?
Well, thank you for the kind words and thank you for the question. The answer is I'm not sure. I don't have a clever answer. But there is one thing I will share. And I don't know if we have any mechanism for sending all the anti-Semites all back into their lairs. As you heard me before, I'm fairly pessimistic about this. But I suppose part of the answer is just as we have all striven to make what we call casual racism unacceptable. If we sit round our dinner tables and we talk as families, and perhaps sometimes people of the older generation might make a comment which is offensive to Black people, or offensive to Aboriginal people, or offensive to women, I think is now much more common to say, no, we don't accept that, to call people out on their casual racism. And that's what we should be doing. And I think to a large extent, that's what we are doing. And I think we had to do that. We must encourage people to do the same for anti-Semitism. But I think there's another whole discussion. I don't want to take up the next half hour of your meeting about the relationship between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. Can you be anti-Zionist without being anti-Semitic? My answer to that is, in theory, yes, but I have never met a person who can do that. I've never met an anti-Zionist who's not actually anti-Semitic. And by treating Israel in a way differently to every other nation, double standards, by demonizing Israel, by delegitimizing Israel, those are the 3 Ds that Nathan Sharansky formulated about how to spot an anti-Semite. Delegitimizing Israel by saying that Israel shouldn't exist. And there's been 75 years or 76 years of violence, which of course goes back to the creation of the State of Israel. If people speak in any of those terms, they are being anti-Semitic, and we should encourage those who hear such comments to call them out. Not to mention the, if you like, in-your-face anti-Semitism, when people say you can't trust a Jew, or you don't want to deal with Jews, or you don't want to be too close to Jews. Obviously, that's clearly identifiable as anti-Semitism, but I think it's important that we include those 3 Ds, the double standards, demonization, and delegitimization. And if people speak that way about Israel or about Jews, we should encourage those who hear those comments to call them out and say that is unacceptable. So on the spot here, without notice of your question, that is the beginning of my answer.
Yeah, well done. Yeah, fantastic. And we agree with you 100%, Rabbi. I don't know if you know or have had time. I mean, SCAFI is a now 5-year-old organisation, and we represent over 45 Christian ministries, as well as Jewish. You know, we have many friends in our Jewish ministries and synagogues, etc. And we've worked out that we actually represent some 400,000 people in Australia that support Israel. Unfortunately, we Christians haven't got our act together to actually stand together up until the last period of time, but it is coming very quickly now with groups like Never Again Is Now, that are holding, their events in all the major capitals to support Israel. Melbourne is happening, I think, in May. There'll be a Never Again Is Now at the gardens, the old Treasury Gardens, and Perth is happening, and Adelaide is happening as well. So people are coming out of their shells, which is a wonderful encouragement to the Jewish people. I did notice that one of our big supporters, Ian Warby, who's chairperson of Christian for Israel, had his hand up. Do you want to ask a question, Ian?
Yeah, I was going to ask a similar one to what Steve said, but a lot of commentators are saying, for those of us that do remain silent, that first they come for the Friday people and then for the Sunday people. And so we're obviously wanting to encourage Christians who have shared values with our Jewish brothers and sisters to stand up, recognizing that in one sense, Israel and the Jewish community are the canary in the proverbial coal mine. And if we don't react and if we don't respond, then pretty soon it's going to have a very bad impact on our freedoms and our life as well. So I just want to know what your comments were on that. And again, how do we go about educating people to make them informed so they're not just parroting the slogans and all the things that are being spewed out on social media and so on. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, again, I'll try. I don't have a complete solution. I don't really have any sort of solution, to be honest. But I would say, first of all, I think social media does matter. I spend not a lot of time, but a bit of time responding to some of the horrible things on social media. Not that I'm going to convince anybody. But the reason I do it, and my wife says to me, why do I bother? And the answer is because I think it's important for supporters of Israel, Jewish and non-Jewish, to see responses so that the anti-Zionist, the anti-Semite shouldn't have the floor to themselves. So that if you find 20 horrible, vicious comments, the 21st will be somebody saying, will be somebody sticking up for Israel. And I think it's important that those comments, even if it's 1 out of 21, are there. We should not leave the floor to our enemies for them to spew their hatred. Of course, social media is part of the problem, and the fact that you can't have a reasonable debate, let alone dialogue, with people on social media is part of the problem and puts us in the situation we're in. I think the idea that first they came for the Jews and then they came for the Christians has a lot of validity to it, with a little bit of a caveat. And sadly, as I said before, I won't repeat myself, I do think anti-Semitism is unique. I think the fact that the Jews have been society's scapegoats for the last 2,000 years is something about the way society, the way civilization works. I haven't got any rational explanation for it. I think you need some sort of mystical explanation for it. And I don't want to claim a special mantle of victimhood. That's not what being Jewish should be about. But I think anti-Semitism is special in the sense it's unique, and I don't think it's replicated in opposition to other groups. Of course, there is racism, and of course, there is factionalization throughout society, but the way society has it in for the Jews is something unique. Having said that, I think your main thesis is absolutely correct. I think one of the frustrations that Israeli people feel is Israelis see themselves as fighting for the defense of civilization in the current war. And the rest of the world doesn't seem to say thank you, let alone even appreciate what they're doing and the sacrifices that the Israeli people are making, sometimes the ultimate sacrifice. And I think this message that what Hamas represents and Hamas supporters represent is the antithesis of civilization itself. And it goes back to where I started in my presentation, that I do believe the world is gradually getting better, but it's in fits and starts, and there are serious backward steps. And obviously there's a terrible irony and an absurdity in progressives lining themselves up with jihadists, because they really shouldn't go together. The only thing that unites them is hatred of Jews and hatred of the societies that they've come from. So whereas Israel is on the front line, what Israel is fighting against is not just anti-Israelism and anti-Semitism, although that's part of the mix, but it is fighting in defense of civilization. And what Hamas and its supporters represent is barbarism. And I think we need to get that message across. So obviously I'm only really echoing what you're saying. But this message that what Israel is fighting is threatening the West as well is a very, very important message. But no, I haven't got a better way of articulating it than you offered yourself.
That's
John, I see
good.
there is somebody else with a hand up.
Stephen Green, one of our committee members, has got his hand up. So we'll give Stephen a minute for a quick question. And we agree with you. We see the battle as physical, moral, and spiritual. As you mentioned, mystics, and we look as Christians to all of those areas in our own lives and what is happening. Stephen Green.
Thank you, and thanks, Rabbi Kennard, for joining us. My kids go to Mt Scopus College. I'm actually on my way home from Year 7 parent-teacher evening now. My question is, you dedicated your career in the education sphere. What, to your knowledge, can be done to implement more programs of tolerance and education to kids in the curriculum in the school system around Australia? Is there anything tangible that can be lobbied for?
I don't think I've really got much to add to what you're already surmising. I don't really know. I think there's the classic answer, the almost knee-jerk reaction to your question is Holocaust education. And I think Holocaust education is very, very important. I'm quite proud to be associated with a program that takes about 30 non-Jewish teachers in non-Jewish schools every year to Yad Vashem to help them teach the Holocaust in an even better way. And I think it's very important, but it is also important not to think that it's enough. And the Holocaust tells us what happened to people a long time ago in the past. There's a universal message of the Holocaust, which is we should all be kinder to each other. and stand up against racism. There's also a particularly Jewish response to the Holocaust, which is Jews need to be able to defend themselves and not put themselves in the same vulnerability that they were in the 30s. That message is often downplayed, and the universal one sort of eclipses that particularist one, which I think is a bit of a problem. So what I'm saying is Holocaust education is part of the solution, but what else is part of the solution, I'm not entirely sure. I would say one thing, though, and I think this is important, but I don't quite know how you do it, which is explaining to young people the dangers of social media. And I don't mean being on the phone for too long, which actually I don't think is such a terrible thing. Perhaps I'm a bit of an outlier on that. But the way that information is conveyed with no control for accuracy, no control for quality, no control for profundity, the way that a lot of young people, and not so young people, by the way, get their information and get their ideas from what's presented to them in a very shallow and often false way on the internet, I think that needs to be taught in schools. How exactly you do that, I'm not entirely sure. I have retired from the education business.
Wonderful. And
best wishes to your children.
Thank you, Rabbi, and thank you for all your teachings that you have done with many young people. And we just we want to keep in touch with you and see how you go with your Aliyah. We're going to have.
Can I just take 1 minute to thank people who've put words in the chat, some very kind words, which I'm sorry I haven't had time to answer some of the particular questions. But if anyone wants to be in touch with me, my email is easy to remember. It's james@kennard.com, and Kennard is Kennard.
Wonderful.
Kennard, james@kennard.com. Maybe put that in the chat, actually.
Yes,
there it is. Thank you, Margot. So I can't promise to reply to everything if I get inundated, but if people want to continue the conversation or perhaps invite me to speak to your group, I wouldn't speak in a church, that's the situation, but I'd be happy to speak outside of a church to congregations. I'd be happy to do that for the next 2 months before I depart for Israel, and after that, Zoom, I suppose.
might take you up on that. On a Sunday afternoon, we have what we call a KB meeting with the Israeli participants and Jews and Christians coming together. So I might take you up on that. I'm going to pass now to Steve Lieblich to introduce our next guest, Joel. Over to you, Steve.
Thank you, John. It's my pleasure to introduce Joel Burnie, who's a Perth boy originally, although he lives in Melbourne now. Joel is the Executive Manager at the Australia, Israel and Jewish Affairs Council. And he's grown up always involved with the Jewish community in many different ways. He was a president of the Australasian Union of Jewish Students in his student days. And he's also been an office bearer at the Zionist Federation of Australia. Now, in his role at AIJAC, he leads international delegations, parliamentarians, journalists, and other influential people on study tours of Israel, and he's led delegations to the United Nations as well. He often presents at public forums like this one, and it's a great pleasure to welcome him. Joel, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Steve. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for having me. My apologies, I'm not in my normal setting. I'm in a hotel room in Canberra at the moment after a very long, excruciating day in Parliament, but I'll get to that during my talk. But suffice to say that I'm very happy to be with all of you tonight, and I hope the next 20 to 25 minutes or half an hour will be informative, entertaining, and that hopefully we'll all get something out of it. I just did catch the tail end of Rav Kennard's talk, and I'm very happy to be able to share the virtual podium with him. So regards to Rav Kennard. So as Steve was saying, I work for a wonderful organization called AIJAC, which stands for the Australia, Israel and Jewish Affairs Council. And one of my many roles in the organization is the distinguished privilege of being able to take non-Jewish Australians to Israel, mainly for the first time, which is an incredibly rewarding experience. And our study programs that we run at AIJAC include parliamentarians, defence and diplomatic officials, clergy, trade unionists, journalists, students, political advisors, social media influencers, you name it, we take them. I just arrived home on Sunday evening after 4 weeks away, and I took 3 groups. I took a group of journalists, 9 journalists. It's followed up with 7 federal members of parliament. And then I just had the privilege of having Nova Peris, her husband, Scott Appleton, and another Indigenous leader named Sean Gordon on what was a very wonderful trip to Israel. So amongst many things that I do, I guess what I would like to take your time and talk about tonight are my impressions of my 2 trips that I've made to Israel after the tragedy of October 7, reflect on what I've experienced, what I've seen, both here in Australia and also in Israel. And then if we have time, I would be more than happy to open it up to some questions and answers as well. So as I said, I've been twice now. I went in December of last year with a federal parliamentary group, a group of 5 federal MPs. And let's say that the progress that Israel has made on a lot of different fronts since December has been quite remarkable. So a bit of a word about the actual practical place of where we are at the war. So Israel has greatly reduced the amount of soldiers it has in Gaza, which is proportionate to the amount of actual warfare that is occurring. So the majority of the war effort has slowed and is now concentrating on the last area where Hamas battalions are still prevalent, and that's in the city of Rafah. So I'm sure that many of you have heard about the city of Rafah, with the United States and other allies, including Australia, warning Israel about going in there. And we can talk about that and we can unpick that. But essentially, Hamas had a total of around 24 battalions in Gaza before the war started, somewhere between 25,000 to 30,000 armed soldiers. And each battalion controlled a certain geographical area of the enclave. Since the start of the war, Israel has been successful in eliminating 20 out of the 24 battalions. So the job is nearly done. They're finishing off the last battalion in Khan Yunis, which is one of the southern cities, before concentrating the effort on the last city, which is Rafah. Now, as many of you are aware, the difficulty with Rafah is that there's a number of civilians, mainly for the north of Gaza, that are currently sheltering in that city, about 1.4 million people. So that's a big reason as to why Israel hasn't gone into Rafah just yet. It's a different type of mission that is required there. And whilst the commentariat around the world is pointing fingers at what Israel potentially is going to do, I'd like to have a look and assess what Israel is currently doing. And they are currently not going in. They are currently not going to go in anytime soon with the firepower that they have used in other areas that were far less populated because the population was able to get out. And plans are being drawn up now to somehow move a large portion of that civilian population out of Rafah to the north of the city and south of Khan Yunis, where there's quite a bit of spare space where the civilians can hopefully go. But the Israelis are currently going through a lot of different scenarios, both for the movement of people out of Rafah, but also some limited military ways that they can go in a little bit here and a little bit there, and slowly but surely take out the last remaining battalions of Hamas. Now, just within that paradigm, I asked myself this question. I did a couple of weeks ago. One thing that I didn't understand, I was waiting to hear of alternatives that were offered by those that were judging Israel's potential operation in Rafah. And one of the most obvious ones I still haven't heard from a Western leader, from an Australian leader, from a leader of the United States or the United Nations. And that is to avoid the potential devastation of civilian life in that city. Why is there not a question or expectation that Hamas surrenders? So the foreign minister claims that Hamas has no role in the future governance of Gaza, which I wholeheartedly support for obvious reasons. But if you leave 4 battalions untouched in Rafah, how does Hamas not have a role in the future governance? What Hamas will do is Hamas will regroup. Hamas will grow, and Hamas will continue to control a certain territory of land where they can and will launch copious amounts of rockets and potentially launch cross-border attacks, just as they did on October 7th. So the idea that the international community expects Israel to stop at the border of Rafah and not go in when the majority, if not all of the 134 hostages, dead or alive, unfortunately, are located, is an expectation that I believe is A, unfair, B, is steeped in double standards that apply to Israel that would not apply to any other nation in that region, and significantly hampers Israel's legal right to its own self-defense. So in the assessment of what's currently going on in the war, I have a commentator here in Canberra. His name is Ehud Yari, and he's been covering Arab and Israeli affairs for a very long time. And his claim is that the current war effort as we know it is over. We are moving and transitioning into a new phase of the war, which is what I call a counterinsurgency. So the analysis of the war and to prepare everyone for what's going to happen in the next 6 to 18 months is that Israel is going to maintain a military presence in the enclave for a long time. As to how long, I cannot tell you, but it's not going to be months. It's going to be years. Israel has no interest in reoccupying the enclave, and it's not going to do so. But it will maintain the ability to be able to go into certain sections of the main population centers and be able to take out squads of Hamas fighters that still remain. Now, to those that are claiming Israel's goal of eradicating Hamas is unobtainable, I will say this. Israel wants to eradicate Hamas's ability to control territory and also to utilize that territory for military requirements to be able to target civilians in Israel. Israel undeniably wants to stop that from happening. So they're not trying to kill the idea of Hamas. Need I remind the audience, there was an awful terror attack in Russia a couple of days ago where it appears as though that ISIS carried it out. So the Australian war against ISIS in Iraq 5, 6, 7 years ago in Mosul also was never going to eradicate the idea of ISIS, but didn't make the operation in Mosul any less virtuous. Eradicating that area of its ability to be able to be held by a terror organization such as ISIS was a noble pursuit and one that Australia should have and did pursue. And so I don't think that, I think that the international community and its noise about Rafah is not really being heard in Israel. So many of you would know that there was a political divide inside Israel before October 7 about judicial reform and things like this. There is ultimate consensus inside the country about the policies of Netanyahu. Now, those policies are clear. They are to remove Hamas from power, to de-radicalize and demilitarize the Gaza Strip, and also finally pursue the normalization with Saudi Arabia, which was one of the main reasons as to why Hamas launched its assault against Israel on October 7, was to derail the Saudi-Israeli normalization, which the Iranians saw as a huge geopolitical and strategic threat to them, because if the Saudis and the Israelis normalize, then that's essentially an end to the Arab-Israeli conflict. Done. The Saudis are the big fish. If the Saudis make peace with Israel, then hopefully Indonesia would make peace with Israel, and other countries would make peace with Israel. And so Iran's octopus-like tentacle manipulation of the region would be significantly hampered, if not completely diminished, if there was that normalization. So the Iranians get on the phone to Hamas and tell Hamas to carry out the attack, probably promising that there would be a second and third wave in the north with Hezbollah and a third wave in Syria as well. But unfortunately to Hamas, the Iranians reneged on their promise to them and they didn't come. So what's happened is that the military campaign in Gaza has been very successful, and Israel is very, very close to finishing off those last 4 battalions, which it will do shortly. Now, I was unable, because I've been at a dinner, to hear the remarks from before, but I also don't want to just speak about the South. I also want to speak about the North. So I spent considerable time on the Lebanon border, and my hotel in Jerusalem, for instance, has a group of Israelis, displaced Israelis, that have been living in the hotel for the past 5.5 months. So one of the things that is not well known in the Australian public, let alone the public in general, is that since October 7, there were close to 275,000 internally displaced Israelis from the south and from the north. The majority of the southern residents have been able to return, those that want to return. So it is currently, it's safe-ish to be down there, even though there was quite a lot of rocket activity in the south again this morning. But unfortunately, there's still about 75 to 80,000 residents of the north that are 5 kilometers from the border with Lebanon, large population centers that are unable to return to their homes. And this position is not tenable for Israel long term. And whilst the focus has been entirely on the south, there will have to be a pivot to the north. Now, whether or not there's a diplomatic resolution that could be negotiated is one question. But the big problem is that Hezbollah's arsenal compared to Hamas's arsenal is much worse, meaning a war with Hezbollah in the north would be far more devastating for Israel than the war with Hamas. Now, I know that many of you saw horrific video footage from what Hamas did on October 7. I myself had the, I certainly wouldn't call it a privilege, but I had the unfortunate responsibility of having to watch the uncensored 47-minute video, not once, not twice, but 3 times in the past 3 weeks. And the true barbaric nature of what Hamas did was completely terrifying. But in terms of the potential of destruction of the country itself in Israel, Hezbollah has a far greater capability of inflicting that destruction than what Hamas does. So a war in the north would not be pretty for Lebanon, but it certainly would not be pretty for Israel. And the reason is because Hezbollah has a much larger arsenal of highly sophisticated rockets, precision-guided missiles. So essentially, they can put in GPS coordinates of a building, and they have great success and accuracy at targeting those buildings. Now, some of you may say, well, Israel's got amazing air defense systems. That it does. So much so that it's selling them to countries like Germany, and they've been able to test in operational format new systems such as the David Sling and the Arrow system. So Israel has a multi-tiered, multi-layered air defense system. Unfortunately, it can't catch everything. So by some estimates, Hezbollah would potentially look to fire thousands of rockets at a time, which would completely overwhelm the air defense systems, which would guarantee that some, if not many, of those missiles and rockets landed in the places that they were supposed to land. This would be very, very bad news for Israel. So we have to focus on the good developments in the south. As I said, in summary, they're currently finishing off in Khan Yunis, and they will focus their attention in Rafah. As to what happens, all I can say is that the Israelis will implement plans to make sure that those civilians that are taking shelter in Rafah are either moved or provided with adequate shelter to protect them from the war. Now, there's only so much that Israel can do in the conditions that they find themselves in. This is a very dense urban environment where Hamas has and continues to utilize its population as human shields without any concern for its population. It has a track record of doing this. There's an abundance of evidence of Hamas doing this, which makes Israel's job at limiting civilian casualties to be very, very difficult. But Israel is doing a great job. And again, I know it's triggering for some people to hear that. You hear the Gaza Health Ministry say 33,787 people have died, mostly women and children. All I can say to you is that I personally, as a Jew who was directly impacted by the horrific massacre and rape and murder that occurred on October 7, please excuse me that I don't want to take the numbers that come out from the same organization that committed that massacre and treat them as gospel. I will not treat them as truth, as those numbers are accurate, because they're coming from the same organization. They're coming from Hamas. They're coming from the same organization that committed those crimes on October 7. I have one of these commentators here that recently had some data from the United States, and by the United States estimates, the revised casualty numbers are around 17,000, of which 13,000 are estimated to be Hamas fighters. That is an incredible successful death rate in terms of combatants versus civilians. Now, again, It's in military terms. We're talking purely in defense, not emotive or ethical or what have you. We're talking about how wars are actually fought, and the kill ratio between combatants and civilians is far better than what Australia did in its offensive in Mosul in Iraq when we were fighting ISIS. So essentially, the Israeli army has done better to limit the casualty rate, the civilian casualty rate in Gaza, far more so than what the Australians were able to do in Iraq, in Mosul. So again, we come down to this question of double standards and expectations. So our foreign minister will say a couple of months ago to her Israeli friends, don't go down this path, meaning listen to your friends, don't do something that's going to alienate you from the rest of the world and ruin your global reputation by going into Rafah, saving your hostages, and essentially ending the war by defeating Hamas. So where does that leave Israel? What is it supposed to do? I can say to you that someone that just spent 4 weeks there, that type of rhetoric from our foreign minister and other foreign ministers or other prime ministers and presidents from around the world, it is not to say that it's not listened to, but they won't follow it. Meaning there is the usual consensus inside Israel, both from the political, the military, and in the public, that they support the complete destruction of Hamas. Now, before I go on, I'll also include that the Arab countries that are so pivotal to the stability of the region, they also agree with Israel and quietly, but still strongly, want the job finished. So that's essentially where we sit in the war at the moment. Israel has greatly reduced its forces inside Gaza. The majority of reservists have been put on leave or put elsewhere, sometimes in the West Bank, but also up north. But from a military perspective, the operation itself has gone quite well. Now, what's going on here and what's going on globally? So the predicted condemnation and double standards applying to Israel is not surprising. The depth of it and the reasons for it is concerning, but again, not surprising. So if you look at the United States, in the last 24 hours, the United States abstained from a UN Security Council resolution, which did indeed call for the release of hostages, but also weirdly called for an immediate ceasefire to coincide with the month of Ramadan, which I don't quite understand as to. Anyway, we'll just leave that for the time being. But essentially, the international community has placed significant pressure on Israel to not go into Rafah, essentially saying that Hamas can remain in power in Rafah or find another way to get rid of them, which is going to be very difficult. The situation with the international community is not getting better, it's actually getting worse. So today in the Senate, I believe it's already passed, but Senator Wong amended a Greens motion, which was loosely based on the Security Council resolution, but went further, as is not surprising from our foreign minister, which again condemned Israel, blamed Israel for the humanitarian crisis inside Gaza, and essentially points fingers that it's all Israel's responsibility to do A, B, C, and D. Now, for the Jewish community and for the Israeli community, that's very jarring to have to hear. For those that know exactly what happened on October 7, so Hamas invades Israel. October 6 was a ceasefire day, a peaceful day. They chose October 7, 50 years after the Yom Kippur War, and on the Sabbath, and also on one of our